And let me introduce our panelists today. This is a panel titled Post-October 7, Eradicating Terrorism and Confronting Anti-Semitism, Advancing Principal Recommendations for America and Israel. Let me start with Jonathan Tobin. He's an editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, senior contributor for the Federalist, columnist for Newsweek and Israel Hayom. He has won more than 60 awards for commentary, arts, criticism, and other writings. He appears regularly on television commenting on politics and foreign policy. And also let me introduce Rabbi Randall Brown. So he's originally from South Florida. He received his BA from University of Florida in 1995. He spent his junior year at Tel Aviv University and returned to Israel to complete his MBA at Bar Ilan University. Rabbi Brown volunteered as foreign relations correspondent for former Prime Minister Shimon Peres. Rabbi Brown proudly serves as the United States Department of Defense civilian rabbi at Arlington National Cemetery, Fort Belvoir Community Hospital, and Walter Reed National Medical Center. Rabbi Brown also serves as an associate for CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, in order to bring active duty United States chaplains to Israel. Join me in welcoming our panel. So, Mr. Tobin, if you would like to start with your remarks.
Well, first, thank you. This has been, for me personally, a very heartening afternoon, evening. It was inspiring to hear so many wonderful remarks from leaders from the faith community. Bishop, you had me up saying, as we say in synagogue, Amen. I'll give you a lot of amens. And to hear members of Congress speaking of their dedication to the U.S.-Israel alliance, to their friendship for Israel and the Jewish people, it was encouraging. And we need that encouragement, speaking for other American Jews, because the last 2 months have been deeply discouraging in many ways. One of the most discouraging things is to realize that when Hamas launched its attack on Israel, committed these unspeakable atrocities, they made a couple of calculations. One of those calculations was that they could actually pull it off, and sadly they were able to. And that was correct. They made another calculation that was incorrect, in that they thought that Israel would not strike back in a way that would alter the balance of power between Israel and Gaza. They thought it was just business as usual. They could commit some crimes, some terrorist attacks, and they would be allowed to stay in safety in Gaza. The international community would help, would protect them. Perhaps even the United States would protect them. That turned out to be wrong, and they are learning that. And even though some of the leaders, the top leaders of Hamas, are in safety, living in luxury in Qatar, their henchmen are paying the price for it. And we will see their doom soon, I have no doubt. But there was a third assumption that goes to the heart of a lot of what we've been discussing about here today in terms of anti-Semitism. They made what might have been considered the counterintuitive assumption that if they were to commit unspeakable atrocities against Jews, if they were to commit, as perhaps they hope to do, and perhaps even hope to do even more harm, the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, that instead of a backlash against them among international opinion, international organizations, elite mainstream corporate media around the world, and even in the United States, that instead it would spark a surge of anti-Semitism. And that shocking assumption, that counterintuitive assumption, proved to be correct, because that is what we have seen. We've seen it on the streets of cities around the world. We've seen it on the streets of our own cities here in the United States. And yes, we've seen it on the campuses of American colleges and universities, including some of the most prestigious ones. And yes, we saw last week that when hauled before a committee of Congress, the leaders of 3 of the most elite institutions in this country of higher education, their leaders were unable to give a straight answer to the question of, does advocacy for genocide against Jews violate your rules? It was shocking. And we've been focused a lot, and as a journalist, we focus a lot on what is the top news of the day. What was the atrocity? What are people saying about it? The demonstrations. But for a moment, I would like us to go a little deeper and to try to focus on what is behind the evil that we have seen in the last 2 months, both the Hamas attacks and the defense of Hamas, and as part of that defense of Hamas, this surge of anti-Semitism around the world. Where does it come from? Why? Well, we're celebrating Hanukkah right now, but if this were in the spring, I could remind us of the Haggadah that we read on Passover, which says that in every generation they rise against the Jews, but that the Holy One, blessed be He, protects us. Well, yes, anti-Semitism is, in a sense, an eternal virus. It's like a virus, it can't be eradicated. It is, as the great scholar Ruth Weiss has said, the most successful of ideologies because it attaches itself as a parasite to other ideologies, whether it was fascism, Nazism, communism, and in the last generation, Islamism. But now there is another ideology to which it has attached itself, and that is what we generally call woke leftist ideology here in this country. And that gets me to my point. Where is this coming from? What made those very bright women who led, in the case of one of them, and still lead in the case of the other 2, to be more worried when they were under the spotlight of congressional questioning about being seen as hostile to the anti-Semites than to protect their Jewish students? The answer is that as part of the long march of so-called progressives through American society, this woke ideology, this leftist belief that seeks to divide us along race, that seeks to falsely analogize the war against the one Jewish state on the planet to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. These are lies. The struggle in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs has nothing to do with race. After all, Jews and Arabs are kind of the same race. It's nothing to do with race. It's not a question of Israel and the Jewish people being possessed of white privilege. As anybody who knows anything about Israel knows, the majority of Israeli Jews are, by the definitions of this intersectional faith, and I call it a faith, people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and to North Africa. This isn't a black and white conflict. Far from it. It has nothing to do with it. And yet, in this intersectional mindset, the elites of our country, brainwashed through the long march of the progressives, through our educational institutions, now think Israel is not merely falsely called an apartheid state, but considered a white oppressor state of people of color. So therefore, it is guilty no matter what it does, and its opponents are innocent no matter what they do. And that is why we see mobs of supposedly educated kids and their professors, cheered on by their professors and administrators, chanting from the river to the sea, which means the eradication of that one Jewish state on the planet. And speaking of intifadas, which means genocidal terrorism against the Jews. We have to focus on that. We have to focus on the long march of this evil, toxic ideology and the myths associated with it. Because if we just focus on trying to fire a few university administrators, we're missing the point. Just as when we just focus on what to do about Hamas, and those calling for a ceasefire for Hamas are, in a sense, asking for the people guilty of mass murder to get away with mass murder. We have to focus also on those who fund and support them, namely Iran. Don't ignore the real story. Don't ignore the real culprits. How do we do it? Well, in just the few minutes we have to speak with each other today, let me remind us of our obligations as Americans and as citizens, that democracy is not a spectator sport. It involves all of us, no matter what role we play. I'm a journalist, there are pastors here, rabbis, citizens, leaders, and we've heard from politicians. But we must all take part in this battle. We must, as the former Navy SEAL turned congressman said, be ready to fight against these evil ideologies. We must understand that this is a moment of moral clarity. And when people like the pundits who write on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post tell us we don't need moral clarity, we need to fight for it even more. And above all, we need one thing. I'm often asked when I go out and speak to Jewish audiences, and whether it's parents, grandparents, students, they ask me, what do we need to know? What do we need to be able to defend Israel, to defend ourselves against this rampant anti-Semitism? What do we need most? Well, yes, you need to know the facts about the conflict, a few of which I just mentioned. Others, we could go on much longer. AIPAC used to put out a book every year called Myths and Facts. It was great. They don't do it anymore. It's online somewhere. Yeah, learn all that. But that's not the most important thing we need. The most important thing we need as aware citizens, Americans, Christians, Jews, people of faith, decent people, whoever and wherever they are, the most important thing we need is courage. Without the courage to speak truth to power, without the courage to fight back against the establishment, against the orthodoxies that have been promulgated and now dominate our educational institutions, dominate now much of corporate America, and yes, dominate parts of this government, which now has, there isn't, thanks to an executive order from our president, there now isn't a department or agency of the federal government that doesn't now have its own woke commissar enforcing these bad ideologies, which grant a permission slip to anti-Semitism. We need the courage to speak back, to speak up, and speak against it. And it's very important to place this in a context for all Americans, because this is about all of us. What happened on October 7th could happen here if we let them get away with it. We're celebrating this. We lit the candles for Hanukkah a few moments ago. We should remember something about Hanukkah, a truth about it, and to remember the history of it, about how a few people stood up, not merely for their own freedom, but against the prevailing ideologies of their day, which sought to crush all dissent, just as today's woke mindset seeks to crush all dissent. I believe the essence of being a Jew, and quite frankly, a decent person, no matter whether you're Jewish or not, has always been a willingness to refuse, as the Maccabees did, to bow down to the idols of popular culture of your day. The Maccabees refused to bow down to the false idols that the Hellenists, imposed upon them and sought to destroy Judaism, Today, we have our own false idols, to which so much of our culture and our leaders bow down to. Just pop culture, movies, TV, our educational system. We must fight back against that. We must find the courage to fight back against that. We must be encouraged by the history of how Americans have often found that courage. Even small people, within the last 80 years and during the time of the Holocaust, we can take inspiration from the fact that when most Americans were just focused on fighting the war and even Jewish leaders were silent, there were a few dissidents who spoke up for rescue of European Jewry, people like the writer Ben Hecht and Hillel Koch. They agitated. They made friends among non-Jews, Christians, members of Congress, and with their activism, they helped create a body that by the end of World War II, it came too little and too late, but it saved hundreds of thousands of Jews in Hungary. Just as a generation later, a group of noisy dissidents started speaking up about the need to free Soviet Jewry and to speak against the tyranny of that evil empire to let those people go free. At first, nobody listened to them, but eventually 250,000 people were on that mall, not far from here, crying out for their freedom, and their freedom was won. Today, we must find that same courage. Even though it sometimes seems as if we're alone or in the minority, I don't believe we are. I believe today, if nothing else convinced me again, the majority of American people are with the Jewish people, with the people of Israel, not just for the fact that they wish to be blessed, but because they know this fight is theirs too. That is the courage we need. Thank you for holding this event. Thank you for your activism. Go forth, be courageous, and fight for the truth of October 7th and for the truth of the fight against terrorism.
Can you hear me? Okay, now I'm on. It's the first time we're meeting. You're very encouraging. I think you had my speech because a lot of it is overlapping. I'm going to deliver it a little bit differently, than maybe we can have some sort of dialogue. Because I was asked by Joel and Natasha to give some context about historically where we are. So the famous Italian scholar Yogi Berra said, it's just like deja vu, except all over again. In the Jewish tradition, in Hebrew, it's ein kor chadash mitachat hashemesh, that there's nothing new under the sun. If you really want to achieve prosperity and be holy agitators and champion the work of the International Leaders Summit, you need to know your history so that you're not bound to repeat it again. In 166 BCE, the Greek army invaded the Holy Land. King Antiochus orchestrated violent acts and religious intolerance on the Jews who were trying to live in peace. Sadly, the Israelites were divided because many had assimilated to Hellenist life, and the Jews were divided and vulnerable. These Maccabees, or Hebrew hammers, were forced to utilize guerrilla tactics and their own knowledge of the land to defeat the cruel enemy and restore security. The oil in the eternal lamp, which was supposed to last only one day, lasted 8 nights so the Maccabees could properly rededicate, which is the word Hanukkah, the temple. Does the narrative sound familiar? Well, in October 1973 and now in October 2023, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel's hubris, left it vulnerable to a failure of intelligence, which resulted in horrific bloodshed. However, tonight is not the time to point the finger, and we must stand united. Kuma Yisrael, wake up. Wake up, we are at war. Since October 7th, my sleepless nights have reminded me of Psalm 121, that the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. We can't afford to be paralyzed due to a lack of imagination or hopelessly cling to antiquated models that yield the same results. My friends, we have been lulled into this false belief of a woke ideology that hard work and success is equated to being an oppressive colonial oppressor. The Jewish community, myself included, is reeling from grief, pain, and fear. For generations, we marched with others to promote justice and equality. But if we're being honest, we must look in the mirror and ask ourselves, where are our social justice partners during our time of need? Sadly, the prevailing answer is deafening silence, or even worse, as was mentioned, genocidal chants from the river to the sea on college campuses that make our children shelter in place and students shudder in fear. Just last week, steps away from here, the presidents from Harvard, Penn, and MIT told us clearly that Jewish blood is cheap and that genocide for Jews can be rationalized as contextual. Israel's military needs to eradicate Hamas's infrastructure and leadership in order to eventually give the Palestinians an opportunity for a new model of self-determination. Listen to me clearly if you can understand one message from me tonight. There is no occupation. Israel unilaterally in 2005 left an agricultural infrastructure and a beautiful beachfront property that could have been transformed into a Riviera resembling the economic success of Singapore. Instead, Hamas kidnapped the Palestinian people, and they embezzled over $16 billion of international aid and American taxpayer money to create tunnels of terror. For any semblance of peace and a ceasefire has to occur, the remaining shattered families of the 137 hostages need to be returned immediately and reunited with their loved ones. We are a people of hope, and we have finally returned to our ancestral home. We are blessed to be Americans. We're nearly 300,000 Jews. It was the first time since Soviet Jewry where we had hundreds of thousands of Jews, and what we assembled peacefully in our own nation's capital. My friends, there's a rabbinic debate in a time of danger that one can be exempt from displaying the menorah to publicize the miracle of Hanukkah. But, as was mentioned by former active duty military, now US members of Congress, we need to have our spines upright. We're not going to bow down to Hellenists or to others who want to instill some other ideology upon us, and we raise our voice loudly. We're not going to yield to terror. We're not going to be afraid to embrace moral clarity, and together we will preserve Lady Liberty's candle, and may it be extinguishable.
As we mentioned Iran, so Iran is labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism. We know that they are funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas is also labeled as a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department. Yet, we had two diametrically opposed policies looking at the former administration. So we saw Obama administration releasing some $1.9 billion to Iran and Biden $6 billion respectively, also relaxing sanctions when it comes to oil exports. On the other side, Trump administration blocked funds to Iran and imposed economic sanctions. So again, when it comes to US administration occupied territories, we can see at the US State Department today, they described occupied territories as being West Bank, also known as Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. And we have visited those areas except for Gaza. As you said, actually, Israelis left the area in 2006. So we know that Jews and Arabs live together, study together, work together in East Jerusalem, in West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So what do we need to do? I mean, what is your advice to the US administration in order to not to perpetuate a problem, basically?
I want to be careful. I'm speaking as Rabbi Randy, not as a Department of Defense contractor, although I wish the policy were there. I actually, frankly, I think it relates to anti-Semitism that we've been lulled to this belief. If only we're nice enough, if only we play by the rules, if only we go by and just get along, they'll like us. If only we give them the money and show them a better way of life, they'll really come around. Unfortunately, the sad reality is this is not a war of territory. This is an existential conflict. When somebody says they're going to kill you, I believe them. And I don't want to be considered this crazy neocon for defending myself. I don't need to be an apologetic. I simply can have moral clarity. I can shore up my friends and allies who also can speak authentically with a voice. And then we are literally sitting in the hill of power. And we need to share this voice. If it wasn't working, you can't just go back to the same paradigm. The Abraham Accords, everyone said it's not going to work. You can't show them. There are over 650,000 Israelis who have traveled to Dubai and the UAE. You've created a new paradigm of people-to-people, of authentic interaction, and as a result, the UAE is resisting calls for recalling their ambassador. I'm sorry, turn the spigot off. Senator Blackburn, I happen to agree with her. Only when you take away the treasure do you really think I'm wearing my necklace for hostages. Anyone who thinks that the hostages were returned because Qatar was negotiating adeptly, they're mistaking themselves. It was only because the IDF was able to come in with force and give them the reality that public opinion is changing, and you need to realize that we're a force like the Maccabees to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I think, well, first, the rabbi, all of his comments were really right on target. I commend him. We have to understand that this administration, in particular, is struggling with what we could only describe as cognitive dissonance. It is trying to do two things at the same time, and there's an old Jewish expression that you can't dance at two weddings at the same time. Yeah, all right. That was, in Yiddish. And yet they're trying to do so. They're trying to do so both on Iran, and they're trying to do so on Hamas. When President Obama sought to basically turn American foreign policy upside down by launching his campaign of appeasement of Iran, which led to his disastrous Iran nuclear deal, which did not prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb. It more or less guaranteed it would happen. And quite frankly, as we've lost sight of that. But just weeks before, this is sort of like a parenthetical thing, but it relates to what we're discussing. Just weeks before October 7th, in fact, I think 2 weeks, I wrote about it. There was a news dump, as they say here in Washington, a Friday afternoon news dump, in which the Department of Defense, you should pardon the expression, issued a report saying that Iran now had enough nuclear material to be only 12 days away from a nuclear bomb, which is to say they're more or less there already. They're a threshold nuclear power. This happened as a result of a deliberate choice by the United States to basically turn away from traditional allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia and to make Iran the new linchpin of American foreign policy. President Obama defended it, and I'll take him at his word, that he said he wanted to give Iran a chance to get right with the world. That was nuts because Iran didn't want to get right to the world. They told him so, and yet he went ahead and did it.
We didn't learn from North Korea either.
No, we did not. When it comes to this administration, they've done the same game. They've pursued Iran, sought to appease them, sought to enrich and empower them with money, with loosening of sanctions, and they've gotten what many of us all along said they would get: war, bloodshed, destruction. And that's what set up October 7th to happen. With respect to Hamas, the Biden administration has said many good things. It continues to do many good things. I'm a critic of President Biden. I want to give him credit for the eloquent statements of support for Israel and condemnations of Hamas, the same with Secretary Blinken. and the fact that they have not turned off the spigot of arms, which Israel needs to continue this fight, because Israel is dependent, as a result of decades of American policy, to keep Israel dependent on the United States for arms. After all, we hear a lot about USA military aid to Israel, which comes out of, you know, the workings of Congress on this Hill, $8 billion a year, which is a lot of money to most of us. It's a fraction of what we've given to Ukraine in just the last year, whether you think that's a good idea or not. But you have to understand something. Almost every penny of that money, those $3.8 billion, is spent in the United States. If anything, it's really an aid package to American arms manufacturers, to Raytheon and General Dynamics, to give them the weapons that Israel needs to defend itself and to get after Hamas. And yet at the same time as the Biden administration is doing that, it's seeking to appease another force, the intersectional, sort of woke left wing of his own party, which he is deathly afraid of. So that's why he keeps trying to gin up disputes with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel, just as he did just today, to set up an argument to sort of show some of his left-wing supporters, or people he wants to support him, that he's really against Israel too. You can't do both of these things. The other side is listening. It strengthens them, it enriches them, it empowers them. And when you don't pursue a clear policy, what you get is bloodshed and war, not defense, not safety, and certainly not peace.
There's a concept in Israel called facts on the ground. And I also want to commend the administration. If they hadn't deployed actual troops in the region, then that would have been even more perceived as weakness. So I agree with you. It's a matter of cognitive dissonance. It's this, I really want you to like me. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to like and love yourself and look in the mirror and stand up for moral clarity. Facts on the ground, we're actually militaristically doing the right thing. We need to back that up now with solidifying the base, getting the aid package through Congress, and then allowing Israel to accomplish its mission of eradicating the Hamas leaders and its military infrastructure.
Right, and as you mentioned for the Abraham Accords, actually it was on the verge of Saudi Arabia normalizing its relations with Israel that Iran attacked, because the Abraham Accords all of a sudden showed that peace and prosperity is possible, that Arab countries are coming together with Israel, that there's a new dawn, that people are able to, people-to-people relationship in trade, investments, and visiting each other. They were precluded from doing so until recently. So we see, and I would like to just take a quote for, follow up on what Jonathan said regarding the conflict. It's not ethnic conflict, actually. This is a quote from Sledgehammer, David Friedman's book. He said, and I quote, "And finally, peace with the Palestinians is possible. If we learn one thing about the Abraham Accords, it is that the historic conflict between Jews and Muslims is neither religious, nor racial, nor inevitable. Indeed, many do not even remember why the conflict ever existed. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be resolved with bold new Palestinian leadership who place the interest of their people above their own Swiss bank accounts." So the momentum that was built through the Abraham Accords came to a sudden halt with a change of administration. I have to say that. Your thoughts?
Well, the Abraham Accords was one of the great achievements of American foreign policy of this past generation. And it didn't get enough credit. But it has been set back by October 7th. That was part of the goals of Hamas. And it exposed sort of the problem. Ambassador Frieden, with whom I just spoke, actually we shared a platform just several days ago in Florida, and he was absolutely right. This conflict is not inevitable. If there's anything I learned, one of my professors, history professors at Columbia a long time ago when I was there, said to me, and I've always kept it in mind, he said that everything in history is evitable. People make a difference. Movements make a difference. Faith makes a difference. But hate also can make a difference. evil can make a difference. Hamas was counting on this wave of anti-Semitism. The disconnect between some of the leaders of the Arab world and some of their people, many of whom are deeply influenced still by anti-Semitic ideologies that are, quite frankly, funded by governments like Qatar and movements like Hamas, Islamist movements throughout the region and indeed throughout the world. It's been put into jeopardy. Let's be honest about that. Hate, is not to be dismissed. It is powerful. But the answer to it, of course, on one hand, we have to pray, we have to do right, we have to do good, but we also have to show that hate can be defeated, militarily defeated. That's why Hamas needs to be wiped out. Movements, often the pundits of the corporate media tell us, Hamas is an idea, it can't be defeated. Well, Nazism was an idea, and it was defeated by Americans. And the force of American might, the righteous force of American might. Israel must be allowed to finish this war. That is the clear question right now. And quite frankly, if Biden needs to talk out of both sides of his mouth in order to let them continue to do it, if he needs to pretend half the time that he's actually against Israel in order to continue the policies that will enable Israel to win this war, I say fine. We'll deal, once the war is over, we'll fight that battle then. But for now, the main thing is to keep the aid flowing and to push back against those calling for ceasefire, which is, as I said before, it's basically a get-out-of-jail-free card to Hamas for committing mass murder. And it doesn't matter whether it's actresses or so-called peace activists who are saying this, they are actually fighting, in this case, for more war, more conflict, more hate. We have to fight back against them. That's where we need the moral clarity. They're seeking to cloud the issue. We must respond with truth, courage, and the clarity to say, this must not succeed.
I'm a technology laggard, and this TikTok generation, you don't go beyond yesterday's news. Henry Kissinger just died at the age of 100 years old, and shuttle diplomacy was in vogue for land for peace. Well, that paradigm is it's gone. It doesn't apply to today. I was scared, to be completely honest with you. My cousins literally are on the front line in the South and in the North. It was a total gut punch. The Israeli society was paralyzed. The government, just like the Maccabees, when I was talking about before, for months in the street, peacefully, I'll mind you, Israelis were at each other's throats. And then there was a golden age of achdut, of unity, that we haven't seen. Prior to 1948, it was Israel as David, and then they became Goliath, and then they were, again, we've spoken about being perceived as the oppressor. Well, where are we now? I'm less concerned about what's going on in press conferences, and I'm much more concerned about what's happening on the ground. Both also in the previous administration, there was a lax of American force in the region. I'm equally critical, and I give equal accolades when they're deserved to all administrations. And when that vacuum was perceived of being more isolationist, it filled the gap. So back to your question of the idea of the Abraham Accords, of course, it's deliberate. They wanted to be at the table. But the truth of the reality is, as Golda Meir said, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity. They miss an opportunity. The reality is the piece of the pie is getting smaller and smaller. We just commemorated Pearl Harbor. Do we need to forget what the British did in Dresden, what we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? In any actual armed conflict, unfortunately, civilian life is lost. The question is, are we going to have the moral authority to be able to stand up to evil? I don't need a definition of what anti-Semitism is. I don't need a definition of what evil is. I know it. The reality is, do we want to be able to look in the mirror and stand up? The last thing I'll say, this is a marathon, and that's why I thank Joel and Natasha for the invitation. If we don't come, if we don't assemble, and we just allow the others to fill the vacuum, those voices will just make it mainstay, and they'll allow it to come in, and then the public cry that's in the mob will unfortunately usurp moral authority. Don't give up.
I'd like to add just one more thing, and kol kavod, Rabbi. Let's also remember that the misinformation, the anti-Semitism, as I said before, doesn't come out of a vacuum. One of the ways that it is empowered is by biased media coverage of this conflict and of this discussion. I could give, we could hold a whole session on that, but we need to acknowledge it, and how so much of what is reported in our mainstream corporate media is slanted, biased, just frankly false, as they would say, disinformation. And what we need to do, just as we need to hold our universities and colleges accountable, and defund them, rightly so, as the senators are trying to do. Good luck to them with that battle. Just as we need to hold them accountable and defund them, we as citizens need to hold the media accountable.
Absolutely.
We need to stop supporting media that lies to us and start supporting media that tells the truth. Now, I'm part of a media that tries to tell the truth, but it's not about me and not about JNS. It's about the way institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the broadcast networks, CNN, MSNBC, it's like their authority comes from their economic strength, comes from their ability to pretend that they speak for American people and give them the truth. But the truth is, most of them involved in it don't even pretend to be objective anymore, because a whole new generation of journalists has been infected with this woke mindset. So they're progressive activists. They're not seekers of the truth. They don't even pretend to be seekers of the truth. We need to push back against them, just as we should push back against those politicians that enable anti-Semitism and those institutions that protect it, enshrine it, help it grow. That's what we need. That's part of our struggle. Of all the struggles that we need to do, we have a long list of things that we've given ourselves to do, but we have to attack them systematically. And if we do, I have no doubt, with God's help, we're still going to win.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Jonathan Tobin and Rabbi Randall Brown. Thank you. Thank you.